Good morning. This is Shay Spencer. Um, we are going to cover about the first 30 slides of this endocrine lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, I'm going to be doing these lectures as a means to help you guys preview the lecture material before you come to class. This will also serve as a way to look back at lectures and see what I thought was important, or maybe something wasn't covered in class that um, was clear for you at the time. So you can look back and kind of go from there. I hope this supplements your study. Um, Please reach out for suggestions if you think there's any ways that I can make these videos better. So, looking at the whole picture here, hormones are a type of substance that's produced by the endocrine system. They have numerous and diverse effects on the body. So, hormones are going to be responsible for um, a baby. Um, for example, whenever a new mother hears her baby crying, her breast is going to release milk, and that occurs through a hormone that we'll discuss later on called oxytocin. We are going to, through the study of the hormones, we're going to understand why we develop pubic hair and armpit hair, and we begin to grow around the ages of 14 and 15. That's going to be due to the increase in androgens and estrogens present within our body whenever our body starts to undergo through puberty. We'll understand concepts such as osteoporosis, the thinning and wearing down of bone. Um, and we'll understand the estrogen's effect in maintaining normal bone density. And like this last sentence says, all the scenarios previously discussed without conscious control are due to the release of hormones and their effects. Here are going to be the objectives, and this is going to be all inclusive. If you can answer these objectives, then you're going to be successful in this class. You're going to understand what's important. I'm going to try to list these objectives before every class. I think that's a good way to. Um, I think that's a good way to study is by answering the objectives. So again, here's another one. So here is some basic terms that are going to be important to know. I just want to point out that hormone. Hormone is going to be either Greek or Latin, and it's going to mean to excite or to get moving. So the hormones are going to be produced from these different, what we call endocrine glands, and endocrine glands are going to be either exocrine or endocrine. So I'm sorry, glands are either going to be exocrine or endocrine. Endocrine is going to secrete their products into something called the interstitial fluid, and that's just going to be the fluid that is present in the bloodstream, right? Whereas the exocrine are going to secrete their products into ducts. So an example of an exocrine gland is going to be the pancreas. The pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions. The exocrine function is going to be through the secretion of chemicals such as bicarbonate. It's going to secrete bicarbonate into something called the pancreatic duct. So, where its endocrine portion is going to secrete the product into the blood. So, whether that be insulin or glucagon, both of those are going to be endocrine portions of the pancreas. So, the endocrine system is going to be a collection of systems that secrete their products into the blood or the interstitial fluid, right? Um, Hormone, like we said, it means to excite or get moving. Hormones are going to regulate the activity of cells in other parts of the body. So, like I said here, usually the bloodstream if it's endocrine. So, these are some basic terms to be aware of. Here is a picture depicting all of the major endocrine organs. Again, this whole chapter is going to focus on these different organs and what they do and where they're located. So, again, you know that anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is going to discuss what they're made up of, their structure in general. Physiology is going to discuss what they do in terms of the body. So the pituitary gland, just going to give you guys a brief overview. It's not important to know all of these things right now. These each have individual slides that I'll go over, but I want to just give you a brief overview. These are some of the major endocrine organs that are listed below. The pituitary gland is going to be a gland that is located within the brain. It is going to be responsible for the secretion of hormones such as TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And again, TSH is going to be a mediator that goes down to the thyroid and cause stimulation of things like metabolism. Thyroid gland itself, like I just said, this is going to be the gland that's responsible for the production of T3 and T4. This is going to regulate the basal metabolic rate, or the temperature of your body, as well as things like um, uh, heart rate. Can do a variety of things as well, and be responsible for making sure your metabolism is functioning well. Again, people who have thyroid problems wind up gaining weight, whereas people who have an overactive thyroid wind up losing weight. Those terms are called hypo and hyperthyroidism, and we'll discuss that later on. Parathyroid gland is going to be directly posterior to the thyroid. And again, you can break that down. Para means beside, so beside the thyroid. Um, this is going to be a gland that's responsible for maintaining calcium within the blood. The adrenal glands are going to be located on top of the kidney. They're just directly superior to the kidney. They're responsible for secretion of different hormones such as aldosterone, which is responsible for maintaining blood volume as well as salt content within the blood. The pineal gland, this one's a good one that you guys may know. This is responsible for regulation of circadian rhythm, or the production of melatonin. Thymus is going to be responsible for producing immune cells such as the T cells. They're responsible for maturation. The reproductive glands, again, these are self-explanatory. It's going to be responsible for the production of androgens and estrogens, as well as producing the follicles, which are going to be responsible for fertilization, producing the embryo, which will later develop into the fetus. Right. So again, these are just the major endocrine organs. That's a brief rundown. That's not all inclusive. Didn't mean to overwhelm you guys with that, but that's just kind of what we're going to discuss. We'll go into these each individually, and from there we'll move forward. This is an important slide. So this is endocrine glands secreting the hormones, and every hormone, right? Again, if you remember what the definition of hormone is, it's going to regulate metabolic activity, right, in some way. So they're transported, whether they're transported in the blood or transported into the duct. If they're transported into the blood, they're going to bind to something called a target cell. So the hormone is going to bind to a target cell. And all a target cell is it's just a specific cell in which the hormone has a receptor for. So imagine this is thyroid stimulating hormone being produced by the pituitary gland, and this target cell is within the thyroid. TSH is going to bind to the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor. So that's just an example of a target cell. Nothing really more to say about that. Again, I don't think that you have to know all of these steps. I don't think that's going to be important for examination purposes, but they're kind of self-explanatory if you think about it. Bio meaning life, so the synthesis of some type of um, life material. So this is biosynthesis being the first step of hormone synthesis, right? Let's go back to TSH, or thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is going to be made up of tyrosine residues. Tyrosine is something found within your diet. It's an amino acid. And if you guys do you guys remember what an amino acid is? Right, it's a building block of a protein, and you remember those three different codons present um, within RNA. Those are going to make up an amino acid residue. So tyrosine binds to something called iodine. Have you ever heard of iodized salt? Well, we include iodine or iodized salt in our diet in order to make sure that we have enough material for the production of things like thyroid hormone, which require it. So biosynthesis, we have to have the starting material. Once we have the starting material and we make the product, we're then going to store it. And where is thyroid hormone stored? It's stored in the follicular cells within the thyroid. And from there, it's transported. It's transported within the blood. We know that it's bound to It's bound to each other. It's also bound to proteins such as albumin and things like that. Albumin is going to be a protein that is present within the blood. It's often used to transport different hormones and things like that. From there, once it's transported to its desired location, the receptor is going to recognize it. It's going to recognize it, and then once it actually binds, we are then going to have an amplification step. And this is an important because um, this whole process of the hormone being amplified occurs through a process called signal transduction. Signal transduction. So, again, once this hormone binds to its receptor, there's going to be a process that occurs down here, and this is going to be called signal transduction, right? And that whole process is called amplification, amplifying this signal. And then after the desired effect occurs, once thyroid hormone has bound to its receptor, then we're going to need to degrade the um, either degrade or reuptake that secondary messenger, right, or that thyroid hormone. So here are some general characteristics. There's going to be 3 different terms that I want you to know, and it's just the different types of signaling that is going to occur within the thyroid hormone itself, right? Or not thyroid hormone, I'm sorry, just hormones themselves. I'm stuck on that thyroid hormone for some reason. Um, there's something called paracrine, autocrine, and endocrine. So if you can know the prefix of the word, then you can know what type of signaling it does. So para means beside, so paracrine. So these are going to be hormone effects that affect neighboring cells. So beside neighboring cells. Auto means self. So what type of effect do you think an autocrine signaling would have? Who do you think it would affect? That's right. It affects the cell that secretes it. And then endocrine, this is the only one that's a little bit different. Endocrine affects a cell in a different portion of the tissue. So cytokine signals secreted to, what's it say, circulatory system to distant. So distant, that's the key word, distant cells. Paracrine is nearby, neighboring, and autocrine is same. Again, here is just an example of paracrine signaling. This is a paracrine cell, and as you guys know, para means beside, so it's affecting these neighboring cells right here. Some examples of hormones that use paracrine signaling is something called somatostatin, histamine, growth factors, things like that. I don't expect you guys to know what somatostatin, histamine, and growth factors are at this point. I'm just giving you examples that you guys will cover later on. Um, for example, somatostatin is a hormone located within the pancreas that we'll discuss later on. It's responsible for inhibition or stopping the signaling of insulin and glucagon. Histamine is going to be produced by an, immune cells. This is going to trigger inflammation. Growth factors can be secreted by different cells. It can cause growth in a variety of different tissue. If you can remember Andre the Giant, he had a tumor that secreted excess growth hormone that produced growth factors, and that's what caused him to become so large. Here, the text says that paracrine signaling is involved in responses to allergens. Again, that's through histamine. Tissue repair, that's through growth factor. And the formation of scar tissue and blood clotting. This is a true statement right here that I included. The overproduction of certain paracrine hormones has been implicated in cancer. That's true because of this overproduction of these certain hormones affecting the neighboring cells. This has drove cancer growth. Here's an example of an autocrine circuit. Here we have an input of a stimulus. For this example, we are going to use the interleukins, interleukin 1 and interleukin 2. Interleukins are just going to be secondary messengers that are produced by the immune system. This is going to trigger things like T lymphocytes or your memory cells to respond to foreign antigens. Interleukin 1 can trigger different things like the activation of monocytes or your macrophages. Those can undergo phagocytosis and digest foreign bacteria. This is also responsible for red blood cell production. So I'm using a lot of big words, and you don't have to know all those right now. All I want you to know is that this stimulus is causing an input, and guess what? It's affecting the same cell, right? This is an autocrine circuit. I don't expect you to know what interleukin 1 is and interleukin 2 at this point. Endocrine function, this is going to affect, remember, a distant tissue. So here you have secretory vesicles. Secretory vesicles are responsible for storing a product. In this case, it could be a hormone, and it's going to affect a target cell at a distant tissue site. So as you can see here, it's been secreted into the blood vessels, and it's going and affecting a different target cell. Examples of this include oxytocin, growth hormone, prolactin, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Again, not really important for you guys to know these. Just know what autocrine, paracrine, and endocrine does. Moving along here, we have the same picture. Again, just kind of a different illustration for you guys. Autocrine being on the far left, this is the chemical messenger coming in here, affecting the same cell. Remember, the target cells are located on the same cell. This is a paracrine. This is an example of paracrine messaging because, again, look at these target cells on neighboring tissues. And this is an endocrine function. As you can see here, you have a capillary network, and it is getting secreted through the capillary network to a different distant tissue site. These check on learning PowerPoint slides, these are just going to be included in here for one or two things. One, this is going to incorporate active learning. And again, active learning is the best type of learning. This is going to allow you guys to work with the material and see if you guys are understanding some of the different types of things that we're talking about, right? This can also show you what may show up in an exam later on, what type of questions that we like to ask. So I'll continue to incorporate these throughout the year. During lecture, I'm going to ask questions like this throughout the lecture. So I hope you guys like this. So here's an example. And again, the answer is listed, but let's break it down as to why. In the stomach, one stimulus for secretion of hydrochloric acid by the parietal cells is the release of histamine by neighboring cells. Is histamine an autocrine or a paracrine? So what's this question asking? Here it says in the stomach, one stimulus for secretion of hydrochloric acid by parietal cells is the release of histamine. So histamine is causing hydrochloric acid to be released by parietal cells. That's what we're saying. And this key word right here is neighboring cells. So is histamine an autocrine? Is it affecting the cells itself? Or is it paracrine affecting the nearby cells? And we know the answer is paracrine, right? Histamine is causing the release of hydrochloric acid by the parietal cells. So histamine is affecting neighboring cells. I hope you guys see how I came to that conclusion. Can a hormone be both autocrine, meaning affecting itself, paracrine, affecting neighboring cells, and endocrine, or does it have to be one or the other? This is actually a very good question. I wouldn't expect you guys to know this, but actually the answer is it can be all three. It just depends on the location that the hormone is acting, as well as the stimulus, what is causing it to be secreted, as well as the condition. A great example that I listed here is glucagon. Glucagon has many different effects depending on when it is occurring. For example, in a case of people being in starvation, they haven't eaten for a while, glucagon can actually break down something called glycogen, which is stored glucose, and raise the blood glucose levels. This is called glycogenolysis. And again, this is a concept that was most likely covered in your Bio 112 class. Glucagon can also break down fat depending on the time and the location, and depending on where glucagon is secreted, depending on where it is acting, it has many different effects. So we won't belabor that point anymore. This is an important slide for the simple fact that we're going to introduce a concept. Along with hormones, you have different hormone classes. So we know how hormone signaling occurs. We know that it can occur through autocrine, paracrine, as well as endocrine signaling. So what are the types of classes of these hormones? Well, that's a great question, Jay. So there's two different types. There's lipid soluble and there's water soluble. Lipid soluble are going to be exactly like the term implies. It's going to be soluble within lipids, right? This meaning that they can cross the cell membrane. Because they can cross the cell membrane, they do not require a secondary messenger. I'm going to say that again. Lipid-soluble hormones can cross the cell membrane. Therefore, they do not require a receptor. They do not require a secondary messenger. They can directly bind and cause a change in gene expression. Water-soluble. Water-soluble cannot cross the plasma membrane, right? They cannot cross the plasma membrane. Therefore, they must rely on a transport protein. Because they cannot cross the plasma membrane, they require a receptor, and thus they require a secondary messenger to affect gene expression. Some examples of lipid-soluble molecules are going to be steroids. Some examples of lipid-soluble molecules are going to be steroids. Thyroid hormone as well, T3 and T4. So we know that steroids, for example, androgens, testosterone. Testosterone is going to be an example of a steroid hormone. And testosterone can directly cross the plasma membrane. And once it does that, it can directly bind to the receptor, the androgen receptor. And because it can do this, it can cause an influence in gene expression. This makes sense as to why testosterone, whenever it's produced at puberty, can cause us to grow and change our genes. Some other things here. Here I have depicted on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see here, this is a capillary carrying a lipid-soluble molecule. It's crossing the plasma membrane here. As it's crossing the plasma membrane, it is influencing, or it's binding directly to a receptor, causing a receptor hormone complex. This receptor hormone complex is going to then enter the nucleus and trigger gene transcription. Because it triggers this gene transcription, messenger RNA is going to be produced, and then translation is going to occur once it binds to the ribosome, and then protein synthesis is then going to ensue. You don't have to necessarily know all these steps. A lot of this is just going back to that whole central dogma, DNA synthesis, moving on to messenger RNA production through transcription, post-transcriptional processing, producing RNA, RNA producing proteins. So I don't expect you to know all these. What is important is knowing these different types of classes. Here's an example, steroid and thyroid hormone. Steroid and thyroid hormone enter target cells and combine with receptors to form complexes. These complexes activate specific genes in the nucleus and direct synthesis of specific proteins. Here's an example. Again, this is how non-steroid hormones, aka what? Water soluble. This is the same thing. Non-steroid hormones are water-soluble hormones. Non-steroid hormones combine with the receptor in the target cell membrane. This is an example. Epinephrine binding to the beta-adrenergic receptor. This is going to cause this G protein here, which is in the inactivated state, right? Which means it's not working, right? GDP is currently bound. Then GTP becomes activated once this binding occurs. This is going to cause the activation of something called adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase is then going to cause the production of cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is known as a secondary messenger. So what happens, guys, whenever, for example, let's say that somebody has a shellfish allergy and they go to eat out and they accidentally ingest shellfish. What is going to happen to this person? They're going to start flushing. They're going to start breathing in deep. They're going to start, eventually their throat may close off. They may start wheezing, suffocating, right? And what's the treatment for that? An EpiPen, right? Hopefully they're carrying an EpiPen with them. And this is epinephrine. The reason the reason it saves lives is because epinephrine, it binds to this beta-adrenergic receptor. This beta-adrenergic receptor is present on the lungs. And whenever you're wheezing and whenever you have this allergic response, your body starts closing off the airways. And this beta receptor that's present on the lungs is responsible for widening the airways. So the way that epinephrine works is by causing all of this process right here to occur within your lungs. So epinephrine binds to the beta adrenergic receptor. Because it does that, GDP switches over to GTP, becomes activated. It's able to activate adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase can then activate cyclic AMP. This is crazy. I bet you guys didn't realize how complex of a process that was occurring within your body. And this is exactly how it's happening. The most important thing to take away from this is to know that non-steroid hormones are binding to a target cell receptor. And there's secondary messengers called cyclic AMP or CAMP, and it activates something called protein kinases. These protein kinases are going to be responsible for the activation of several different protein molecules, right? There's these things called prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are going to be an example of paracrine signaling. What is a prostaglandin? Prostaglandins are going to be inflammatory mediators. Have you ever had a headache and you experience pain in your head? There's something called prostaglandin E2, PGE2, prostaglandin E2, and this whole process occurs through inflammation. So the arachidonic acid pathway activates cyclooxygenase, produces something called prostaglandin E2. Whenever you take ibuprofen, it inhibits this cyclooxygenase, which prevents the production of this prostaglandin. Therefore, you don't get the headache. These are the different hormone interactions that occur. There's permissive, synergistic, and antagonistic. We will go over permissive. Permissive is when the action of one hormone requires the simultaneous action of another. An example that we use is epinephrine requires thyroid hormones T3 and T4 to initiate lipolysis, or the breakdown of fat. In this case, the thyroid hormones are permissive to epinephrine by stimulating the production of more epinephrine. So epinephrine requires T3 and T4 in order to break down fat. Synergistic means additive. Whenever you use the two hormones together, they have a greater effect than if they were used individually. Here's an example. The development of oocytes in the ovaries require both estrogen and FSH. So whenever FSH is used alone, it doesn't nearly generate that much of an effect. But when estrogen and FSH are present, it generates a great effect. Opposing, this is the best example of these interactions. Insulin is going to be used to lower blood glucose, whereas glucagon is going to be used to raise blood glucose. So antagonistic means they oppose each other. Synergistic means they have additive effects. Permissive means they require simultaneous actions of another. Here we're going to discuss the negative feedback system. And again, this is something that you should already be familiar with that we covered in Biology 137. But again, I am going to cover it again here just to give you guys a kind of a review. So in a negative feedback system, a gland is sensitive to the physiological effect that its hormone brings about. When the physiological effect reaches a certain level, it inhibits the gland. It's essentially a factory. Okay, you have a factory and then you produce so much of a product that you go back to the beginning of the factory line. You say, hey, chill out. We don't need to make any more of this product. And I'll show you guys a picture. Here's an example right here. This is a negative feedback loop. The body temperature increases. Because it increases, cooling process is activated, such as sweating, and this decreases the body temperature. Okay. The body temperature then decreases, then we begin a heating process. We begin shivering, and the body temperature increases, which is going to, and then I don't really like that example. There's other examples that are much better than that, but I like the production of thyroid hormone. TRH, which is thyroid releasing hormone, is going to produce thyroid stimulating hormone, which produces thyroid hormone. Because thyroid hormone is produced, we can go back and we can inhibit thyroid releasing hormone and say, hey, we've got enough thyroid. I'll draw that for you guys in class. This is a picture that's not very well seen, but essentially this is going to show you all the different endocrine glands as well as their location. And here it gives you a brief synopsis of their function. This is a great review slide that shows you some of the glands and where their location primarily is. Again, this is just another picture here. You have the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is going to be present at around where the base of your neck. There's going to be directly posterior, is going to be the parathyroid. There's two of them directly located beside the thyroid. Down here, present around the kidney, is going to be the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is going to have this outer portion called the cortex, and the medulla, which is going to be this middle portion. Down here, present within the ovary, you are going to have the presence of something called follicles, and this is going to be where oocytes are going to mature. This is where follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, that we previously discussed, stimulates production of the follicles in order to produce estrogen. The corpus luteum is going to occur after the follicle degenerates. Corpus luteum is going to be responsible for the production of progesterone. Progesterone is then going to come back and inhibit gonadotropin-releasing hormone. The testes present within males, you're going to have the Sertoli cells, which are going to be the endocrine cells. The Sertoli cells are going to be responsible for spermatogenesis and things of that sort. Here, within the hypothalamus, we are going to have the neurosecretory cells that are going to be present. You can have the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary, as well as the neurohypophysis. This is going to be the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis, is going to produce two hormones that I want you guys to know: antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, as well as oxytocin. We'll cover those in more detail later on. The anterior pituitary is going to produce that much more. They're going to produce ACTH, or adrenocorticotropin releasing hormone. This pituitary and this posterior pituitary, these are going to have the majority of the effects at these organs down here, right? The production of ACTH, adrenocorticotropin releasing hormone, is going to go down to the adrenal glands and cause the production of hormones here. So this is essentially like our messenger. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, guess where it's going to go? It's going to go to the thyroid and cause production of thyroid hormone. This gonadotropin releasing hormone, gonad, is going to cause the production of LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, right? Present within the testes and the ovaries. I'll cover these in more detail. These are transported through this hypophyseal portal system, this series of capillary networks that comes down here, and it travels and it's secreted into the rest of the bloodstream. And we'll cover that in greater detail in lecture. Here, this is going into more detail right now. The hypothalamus, this is a region of the brain that controls the pituitary gland, and it links the nervous system to the endocrine. This is the hypothalamus. This is the pituitary gland. The pituitary, there's two portions of the pituitary. The anterior portion, which is the front, the posterior portion, which is the back. The hypothalamus is responsible for regulation of body temperature, hunger, thirst, fatigue, anger, sexual stimulation, and circadian rhythm. It's responsive to a variety of different things: stress, osmolarity, steroids, pheromones, day length, light. So there's a lot of different stimuli that causes the hypothalamus to release hormones. Here is a cross-section. This is an actual cadaver that you can see here within the hypothalamus. Its location here in relation to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is just going to be this bulb-like gland. As you can see here, it's very much located next to the optic chiasm. This is where your optic nerve is going to send messages in order to be transmitted into what you see on the outside. Here's a better picture where you can see the hypothalamus here. See the pituitary is just directly inferior to it. The optic chiasm is just going to be present close to that as well. There's actually a condition called a pituitary adenoma, in which the pituitary gland gets a tumor growth on it. It becomes so big that it compresses the optic chiasm, and people are driving down the road and um, they start swerving across the midline and they almost hit a car. And you're like, dude, what's going on? They say, hey, I've got tunnel vision. I can't see to the left and the right. I can't see out of my periphery. That's because it's compressing at the middle of that optic chiasm, right? And that's called bitemporal, right? Two sides of the temporal side, hemianopsia, half vision on both sides of the temporal portion. This is the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Again, this is just what I previously discussed. The hypothalamus is going to release a bunch of starting products, and it's going to go through this long bunch of portal vessels here to the anterior hypophysis or the adenohypophysis, as well as the neurohypophysis, the anterior portion, the posterior portion. And this is going to again go out here through a series of arteries and veins. Here's the short portal vessels as well as the inferior hypophyseal artery. This is going to link the hormones to the rest of the target organs. We'll cover two more slides and then I'll come to a conclusion. This has probably gone on for much longer than you guys are kind of wanting to cover. But this is the hypothalamus linking the nervous system to the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. So again, the hypothalamus has these different nuclei present within it, the paraventricular nucleus, the supraoptic nucleus, the median eminence. All of these are going to be responsible for the release of different mediators. So as you can see here, it's going to be responsible for the controlling of the pituitary gland, and it links the nervous system to the endocrine system. So these are more neurologic in nature, these nuclei, and it's going to link these pituitary to the rest of the system. So the pituitary is going to receive messages from this hypothalamus, and it's controlling this pituitary, saying, hey, you need to make these hormones, send them out to these different organs. And it's going to do that through this different capillary network here. For example, the anterior pituitary is going to make something called thyroid stimulating hormone. It's going to work on the thyroid. It's going to make something called prolactin, which is going to be responsible for secretion of milk, right, within the breast tissue. It's going to make something called adrenocorticotropin releasing hormone, or ACTH, and it's going to go down through the adrenal gland and make a bunch of different hormones. Growth hormone is also going to be secreted from the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone is going to be responsible for the breakdown of fat, lipolysis, right, as well as building bone and building muscle. FSH and LH is going to be responsible for the maturation of ovaries as well as androgen and estrogen production. So these are produced both from the anterior pituitary. They go to the respective locations, the ovary and the testy. And something called MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. This is what makes melanin, and this is a byproduct of ACTH formation. So, melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH. These are all going to come up again later on. I just wanted to give you a brief overview. We'll go into more detail on what they do, but you need to know where they are produced. They're all produced from the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, this is important to know. Make sure that you know this. The posterior pituitary only produces two hormones, oxytocin as well as ADH. They produce them as well as store them. They're both stored within the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and ADH. And the rest of these hormones are going to be produced in the anterior pituitary. So if I were to ask you on a test, where was TSH produced? You should know if it's not oxytocin or ADH, guess what? It has to be produced in the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary only produces those two hormones. Real quick, we will get down here to this picture and then we will break. The pituitary gland, like I previously just mentioned, this pituitary gland is going to consist of two portions, the anterior pituitary as well as the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus, remember, is controlling the anterior portion and the posterior portion. This little stalk right here, this is called the infundibulum, and this is what connects the hypothalamus to the anterior and posterior portions. There is two distinct, I said that 75% of the total weight's in the anterior portion. The infundibulum is part of the posterior pituitary portion. This hypophyseal portal system is going to be the blood supply that's coming from the heart. This is eventually how hormones are going to be distributed. So the main things on that I've covered in this lecture that are important, coming to a close. I need you to know the hypothalamus controls the anterior and the posterior pituitary. I need you to know the hormones that are produced in the anterior portion of the pituitary as well as the hormones that are produced within the posterior portion. I need you to know the difference between water-soluble molecules and lipid-soluble molecules. I need you to know how lipid-soluble molecules, how they influence gene expression. I need you to know that water-soluble molecules, how do they, what is the process for amplification of their signal. I need you to know the difference in the types of signaling, paracrine, autocrine, and endocrine. And I need you to know pretty much the anatomy of the pituitary gland. I need you to know about the hypophyseal portal system and be able to explain how hormones are produced. In terms of that, I believe those are the major points. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, I'm available on my office hours. I'm available pretty much any time as long as I get a heads up. So thank you guys.